Hey folks, welcome to Carbon Garage. In today's episode we're going to have a quick look at some of the things that you should do as just general routine maintenance with a car, but especially something like the TVR. We're thinking about things that you should do really before pretty much any journey. An interesting sort of thought is that although I've said before these are pretty reliable cars and there's not really any reason why things should go wrong with them more than with anything else, we've always got to remember they are handmade cars and they are cars that, you know, by modern standards are a little bit older. So they've got some different technologies. The manufacturing tolerances with certain things will be a little bit weaker. And just generally speaking, with any sort of handmade thing, you're going to have different maintenance requirements compared to something that's been more mass produced. So some of the things that, you know, anybody knows that you should really do with their cars, things like checking the oil and checking power steering fluid, coolant and things along those lines. And those are the sorts of things we're going to look at today, just to make sure that before we go on a longer drive tomorrow, that everything is in good health. So to start off with, we're going to check the coolant level. And a bizarre thing seems to happen with TVRs, or at least with Chimaeras, or at the very least with this Chimaera. And something that I've discovered is that after you tighten up the coolant cap, some sort of like genie or something comes into the garage overnight and just does it really, really tight. And it becomes pretty much impossible to actually get it off the car without using something like a cloth, just to provide a little bit more grip and just to generally protect the inside of your hand a little bit. But relatively easy, two-handed thing, just turn that and then unscrew it. And what we're looking for with this is for the level to be roughly halfway up this reservoir. It's kind of interesting because pretty much every car will adopt its own general level. And you probably can't see it on the camera. In fact, I know you can't see it on the camera, but I can tell you this level is pretty good. It's actually a little bit above where it normally sits, which to at least some extent makes sense because this reservoir was topped up about 10 days ago when I did the work in the other video that I talked about with fixing that earth point underneath that pipe. So that reservoir is all good. Just going to do this up. We're not going to do it too tight because, like I say, somebody comes in and does it extra tight for us anyway. The next thing we're going to check, which is up here in this car, sometimes it moves about the engine bay a little bit across different versions of Chimaera, but pretty much every car of this period has exactly the same looking reservoir for the power steering fluid. So again, we're just going to undo this. Hopefully it's not going to be quite as tight as the other one, which it's not. Unscrew that. And first thing we're going to do is we're going to wipe it off just to make sure we're getting an accurate level. And then we're going to do it again. Now, this car does not leak any power steering fluid, so what you can possibly see here, but probably not if the camera wants to focus, which of course it doesn't. But if it did, you would see that level is just a tiny little bit below the maximum, which is all good. And then the final thing that we're going to want to check, which involves shuffling around to the other side of the car, which is a little bit easier said in a small garage. But the last thing that we're going to want to check around the other side of the engine is the engine oil level. And also the engine oil is a very important thing, so we want to make sure that we're getting it right. Because if we don't, it will end up being very, very expensive very quickly. And in order to do that, we're going to have to open the garage door and then shuffle around to the other side of the garage. So bear with me 1 second. So very similar process to with the power steering fluid. When I pull out the dipstick, we're going to wipe it clean, put it back in, pull it out again, and then we're just going to check the level. And again, we're just a tiny little bit below the maximum, which is pretty much perfect. Back in the hole. And that's pretty much everything we're going to want to check on this car. It's a pretty good car. It doesn't really leak anything at all. There's a tiny little bit of oil just gradually dribbles out from my gasket around the top of the sump. So there's not really anything that we have to watch or worry about too much. An interesting quirk with the Chimaera is the brake fluid reservoir is kind of sunk into the side of the inner arch here. So checking the level is a little bit more difficult than it otherwise would be. But similar to the other reservoirs, what we can do is just carefully unscrew the cap and then just check inside. And again, you're going to struggle to see this on the camera, but that reservoir is full to pretty much just below the neck at the top, which is pretty much where the maximum is. So we know that's good as well. Fluid's all looking nice and clean, which is also a nice plus. To check the clutch is a much harder thing. Again, you actually got to take this panel here off and then the clutch reservoir sits inside. So it's not really something you can check on a regular basis. But otherwise, everything here is looking good, and we're all good for a longer drive tomorrow. So I hope this video was a little bit interesting for some people, just to get a sense of what sort of things you will check on a regular basis on a car like this is. It's no different to any other car that you might own, just you might want to increase the frequency a little bit, because like I say, these cars are handmade, and because of that, they're not necessarily going to have the same sort of fit and overall finish that a more mass-produced car would have. The engine is essentially, well, many decades old now. We're going back to the 1970s when that engine was sort of first put into mass production. And obviously technology's come a really long way since then. Manufacturing tolerances have decreased massively. So engines and gearboxes in cars like this are much more likely to leak oil than a more modern car is. So it's always worth keeping on top of it. Even if your car's normally good and isn't losing fluids, every car starts losing it at some point, and the last thing you want is to have really expensive damage because you didn't spend 5 minutes just checking everything out before a long journey. So thanks very much for watching. If you liked what you saw, please like, please comment, and please subscribe to make sure you don't miss out on more similar content. Cheers guys, enjoy the rest of the summer.